North Korea's launch of what it claims was an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM, triggered serious concerns around the world this week. The test suggests that Pyongyang has now achieved a crucial milestone in its pursuit to perfect its nuclear weapons capability. China and Russia have already weighed in. But the real question now, what will Washington do? VOA's Arash Arabasadi has our report from Washington.
North Korea claims its latest test was an ICBM. The missile fell in the Sea of Japan, and the true capabilities of the weapon remain unclear. The missile test, the 11th this year, has stoked fears the isolated nation may be closing in on a weapon capable of reaching the United States. Late Monday, President Donald Trump tweeted that North Korea has just launched another missile, asking, "Does this guy have anything better to do with his life?" referring to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Speaking at the White House alongside South Korea's president, Trump declared the U.S. has run out of patience with North Korea.
The era of strategic patience with the North Korean regime has failed. Many years, and it's failed. And frankly, that patience is over.
So joining us now to talk about the latest North Korean provocation, we are joined in Washington by VOA White House correspondent Pete Heinlein, along with national security correspondent Jeff Selden. I thank you gentlemen for joining us. There's a lot to talk about, this big giant threat. So Pete, first question to you. So the president says the tactic of patience appears to have failed. Has he given any indication whatsoever of what he plans to do?
Well, he said we're looking at severe measures, but he won't say what those are.
Yeah, we don't know what those severe measures are.
No, he's playing it cool. He's not playing his, he's keeping his cards close to his vest. On the other hand, there's this other track, Secretary of Defense Mattis saying, no red lines, this doesn't bring us closer to war. So we're seeing pressure that the administration is putting on China and other friends to try to, or allies, I should say, and interested parties, not necessarily friends, to try to put pressure on the North Korean regime. But the North Koreans have always been a bit impervious to that kind of pressure. So it's going to be a real chess game we're playing here.
So Jeff Selden, on an issue such as this, does the president need to be clear? Does he? Do we know what the range of options that are available to the United States are right now?
Well, all the options are on the table. The military officials, intelligence officials, under this administration, previous administrations, despite previous administrations going with the strategy of strategic patience. All options have always been on the table, and that includes military options. It is interesting, though, that after President Trump came out and talked with the Polish leader about how he was considering severe things and how something is going to have to be done about this very, very bad behavior, that then his Secretary of Defense comes out, meets with the press in an impromptu session at the Pentagon and starts walking it back, saying this doesn't bring us closer to war, as Pete talked about, but also noting that it is a grave concern that every test that the North Koreans conduct gives them more information, noting that this ICBM that was launched had a re-entry vehicle at top, which would have enabled the North Koreans to potentially arm it with a nuclear warhead. Now, was that re-entry vehicle viable? Could it have worked? Would it present a threat? Has it shown that they've taken another step? Those questions still need to be answered, but there's a great deal of concern, and there's a lot of diplomacy going on. There's going to be a lot of wringing of hands and pulling of arms behind the scenes, trying to get the world to take some sort of coherent action to force North Korea to back off a little bit. But the thing is, the one thing that the North Koreans care about more than anything else is regime survival. So unless that is threatened in any way, it's a big question what these other measures can do, because to threaten the regime, do you need to bring in the military? And if you bring in the military, you could see a cascading effect where you destabilize the entire region.
Pete, does this raise the threat level, the fact that they now have an ICBM capable of perhaps attacking an American target?
Well, I think the key word there is perhaps. We don't really know if they're threatening the mainland, if they could reach Alaska. We have to assume that they're getting close. And that's a game changer. At least that's what Kim Jong-un wants us to think. And it does put more pressure on the U.S. administration. Sure. And the U.S. administration is responding in some way with more financial sanctions, especially financial sanctions on China, trying to get China to play a more active role. But as I think it was Charles Krauthammer, the columnist for the Washington Post, pointed out this morning, it's really not in China's interest to cooperate. They don't really share an interest in putting that tremendous pressure on North Korea. They like to have North Korea as a buffer. They wouldn't want to see a unified Korea.
So Jeff, to Pete's point, it's not in China's best interest, actually, to destabilize North Korea. That would cause problems for China itself, right? So is it right for the United States to have actually been counting on China for their help? Can we count on them in the future?
Well, China wants two things. If you talk to former intelligence officials, other former government officials who have looked at this issue, one, they want a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. That's in their interests. Mm-hmm. Number two, they want stability. But what these former officials say, the problem is that China wants stability more than they want denuclearization. So that becomes an issue. Also, China has been doing more, if you listen to administration officials talking about this, to ramp up the pressure on North Korea. The problem they run into, according to some officials, is that North Korea, despite a lot of people looking at it as this hermit kingdom, this backward place where all they're doing is putting money into a weapons program where everything else suffers, they've been very ingenious. They've been very creative in the ways that they go about funding their activities and the way that they go about tweaking the West and other nations, perhaps, that they have a grudge against. So it's a very difficult thing. So what you hear a lot about now is not the primary sanctions, but the secondary sanctions. And so you're really drilling down into some of the banking system, some of the banks, some of the cash operations, which you wouldn't ordinarily target. Can it be done? Yes. Is it as easy to do? No. And how long is it going to be before it actually has an impact on the regime? Those are questions that are a little bit more difficult to answer.
Pete, but do sanctions work against North Korea? I mean, we seem to have tried this before. We tried the P6 talks, and that didn't seem to help much.
No, the history of sanctions is not so good. On the other hand, let's see if some of these banking sanctions that Jeff was talking about will eventually really put the screws to North Korea, because they depend on that money to fuel their nuclear program and their ICBM program. That's the money they're depending on to keep us at on our back feet.
Right, but Jeff, when you tighten up the screws, as Pete suggests, aren't you also tightening up the screws against China? I mean, isn't China the one that seems to be upset more about this? The fact that Chinese banks are now being sanctioned by the United States.
Yes, although again, China's exhibited a willingness to do a little bit more and has ramped up some of the pressure. It's a matter of how far is China willing to go, because again, their main interest is stability, and they don't want to destabilize North Korea. They don't want a situation where all of a sudden you have some sort of war, active war breaking out. Technically, it's still in a state of war between North and South Korea, but they don't want an active war where all of a sudden refugees are flooding their borders and they have to deal with that type of crisis. We're talking a lot about the region, but there's bigger concerns here as well, because it's not just a threat to the region. One of the things former officials worry about with North Korea, as one put it a few months ago, they'll sell anything to anybody. So any technology they develop, any capabilities they develop, they're liable, in order to make money, raise money to prolong the regime, sell it to somebody else, sell it to actors, perhaps terrorist organizations. You know, are they doing that actively with some of the missile technology? Perhaps, but it's always a concern. So it's not, it goes beyond China. So what is Russia, which says it worries about terrorism a lot? How are they going to react to that? How firm are they going to get? There was some suggestion, despite some hesitance by countries like China and Russia to do more, from the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, the other day, that perhaps these nations, it's more public posturing. Perhaps they're not as firm when it comes down to it as they would appear to be.
10 seconds. I'm running out of time. Is this issue likely to come up today at the G20?
Trump and Xi are actually talking today, and you bet North Korea will be top of the agenda.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Pete and Jeff. It is time now for a quick break. When we come back, leaders of the world's 20 largest economies gather in Hamburg, Germany, as tensions ratchet over trade, NATO, and climate change. We'll talk about who wants what and what they're likely to get. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.